as the sort of business end of the Raisina dialogue begins, we have a blockbuster panel, 4 ministers and former ministers, uh, one leading scholar from the Middle East. Let me begin with Carl Bildt, the person to my far right. Carl, in 2023, at this time, Europeans were berating the global south for not upholding European values in Ukraine. In 2024, at this time, uh, the global south was berating Europe for not upholding European values in Gaza. This year, you have the American vice president berating Europe for not upholding European values in Europe. What's going on?
Yeah, that's a bloody good question. Particularly related to the last part. Don't ask me to explain what the US vice president said in Munich about the freedom of speech, because that was to be incomprehensible. But we have free speech in Europe, so he's prepared. He's welcome to come back and say the same thing and see if we can understand anything of what he means. But the first two questions are, or part of the question, somewhat more relevant. Ukraine, you mentioned that as a question of European values. I would say it's not a question of European values. The Ukraine aggression is a question of the fundamentals of international law. Indeed, if you go back to, say, the Nuremberg trial, they defined aggression as the supreme international crime above everything else. And they did that for the very reason that the international system is built on states. It's not the United Nations, really, it's the United States that we have. And respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states is the absolute foundation stone of international security. Everything else flows from that. So the Russian aggression was a fundamental breach of that. In much the same way as sort of Saddam Hussein against Kuwait, and we have a couple of other cases, not too many, and the international community has always reacted very strongly against them. And we had that in this particular case as well. We had 141 members of the United Nations voting to condemn it. I'm not going to mention, I'm sometimes diplomatic. I'm not going to mention who abstained in that particular vote, but anyhow. So I think that's a fairly fundamental thing. Gaza, painful, as is the entire conflict in the Middle East, but slightly different, of course, because Israel did have the right to respond to the terrorist attack, no question about that. But at the same time, it had the duty to respond within the respect for international humanitarian law. Did it do that? In my opinion, not. And the European Union said so as well. There were strong reactions from Europe against the way in which, at the end of the day, the Israelis handled it from the humanitarian law point of view. It was not a question of aggression, but it was a question of breach of international humanitarian law. And then, of course, we have been fairly strong in trying to advocate a resolution of that particular conflict based on international law. Two-state solution, respect for UN resolutions and all of that. If you see that in the last few weeks where the European Union has been very strong in expressing support for what's been said by Egypt, by Saudi Arabia, by the Arab League on Gaza thing, where there have been some fairly straight, you might have noticed, some fairly strange proposals circulated in international debate. And Europe has been very strong in saying, no, international law applies. So the world is a complicated place. I think we Europeans, see if we agree on this, try to base our position, yes, on values, no doubt, but also on the fundamental interest that we have in something called international order, which is far from perfect, but which we want to work as much as possible. And I think our strong reaction to the Russian aggression against Ukraine comes into that, but also the position that we've taken on the resolution of the conflict in the Middle East, whenever that. And then I diplomatically leave the US Vice President to decide.
Thank you. I'm sure others will have a lot to say on that. Dominique Hassler, you have spoken in the past and with some eloquence and determination about big power vetoes in the Security Council negating the sense of the General Assembly. Is the solution a more democratic, less elitist, I would say, multilateral formulation? And how would that work in practice?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me today. It's a great honor to be here. Perhaps I start with the beginning. Where is Liechtenstein located? In the heart of Europe. And for us, the United Nations and the international rules-based order is part of our DNA. We are 40,000 inhabitants living in the same border since 300 years without armed forces. So if there wouldn't be an international rules-based order, if we wouldn't have a strong UN, my country wouldn't exist anymore in a few minutes. So if you ask me about the veto and why Liechtenstein is engaging so much also in the General Assembly, it is because of that. We do believe in multilateralism. We do need a strong UN. And a strong UN is only functioning when we are orientating each other at the framework which we gave us. And I think it is clear that there is a right to a veto, but it's also clearly defined in the Charter. Then we should use the veto. And the problem is really that it's often not used that way, how it is described and how it could be used. And we as Liechtenstein, with our veto initiative, we try just to bring in, we want to not negating the sense of veto, but we just want to say if there is a veto upholded and the Security Council is not working and functioning because of that and is blocked, then we want to hand over the responsibility to the General Assembly. And this is why we brought in the veto initiative. It is also because we always said that if we want to have a strong UN, we have to reform the UN. And that was a first step. It won't be the last one. But I think if the Security Council is not able to act, it is an important step, at least on that was shared by consensus from all United Nations members, that at least then the veto is not the last word. That's also about diplomacy, that at least then we have the General Assembly acting.
Well, I expect your words will resonate with many in the room. Uri Plana, this is a global debate we're having here, but intrinsically at its heart, it's actually a very European debate. Is the stress test of sovereignty and integrity in some senses an argument about the European project? But how Brussels, if I may, implicates, say, Bratislava?
Thank you. Thank you very much for a kind invitation to attend this event again. It's my second time I am here, and it's confirming of importance Slovakia attaches to the relation with India and this region. And I think you have chosen very topical issue for our discussion. While it may sound theoretical, it goes to the core of many of our problems in today's international effort. But when it comes to the question you raised, yes, absolutely, but this is nothing new in the history of European Union, which is about the sharing the sovereignty in between the member states and the sense with and through the member states of European Union and common EU institutions. Big or small members equal share their respective sovereignty in the name of European project. The EU is not going to be United States of Europe for number of reasons, but especially the diversity of the political system of its members. Since in the area of vital national interest, but especially in the foreign policy and the trade, decisions are taken by the consensus. All members equally have possibly to so shape and block any discussion that could harm their interests if necessary. The key element of the European project is constructive solidarity, and this is, I think, very important to understand. Meaning, states are in agreement to seek solution and to support each other. And let me give you one example. We have the rotation of EU presidencies are held by each country for 6 months. And if there is no agreement and some big country is just at the presidency, so it has very much to put efforts to come to any agreement with a low country which is not very favorable with some issue which is raised. So it's normal, and I think it's very good. That's why is so-called European Union about the sharing and no giving up the sovereignty, roughly similar to entering multilateral treaties. It is up to each state to decide what to accept or not. Slovakia is a medium-sized European nation with open, export-oriented economy. 85% of GDP is generated by it. Thus, for us, this is a better alternative to function within the European Union, and I think this is very important to underline. So, at the same time, for my country, it is important to keep the veto right inside the European Union, especially on the issue related to national identity. The current balance between the national and Euro competencies is defined by the existing treaty framework, particularly the Lisbon Treaty of 2009. We fully respect that, and we see no reason to reopen the treaty now. So I think this is a whole picture about how we are behaved within the European Union. And I would like to add something to our fellow panelists, that adherence on international law is the fundamental key for such a size company, a country like Slovakia is, or Sweden or others, and Liechtenstein, because otherwise, if this erosion of international law continues, so there will be disorder, and we have to come back and to start a debate, a serious debate about the reform of UN and Security Council as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pick up on that word disorder with my next question. S. Jaishankar, a few days ago, you gave an interview to the Financial Times where you said, and I quote, "If we don't have an order, then you are looking at a very anarchic world, very Hobbesian." But you also said, and this was the headline of the article, in fact, "The virtues of the old order, of the old world order, are exaggerated." Why are they exaggerated?
Well, first of all, good to be with all of you and with all of you too. Look, I think we do need an international order, just like we need a domestic order. So if you need a society in a country, you need an international version of that. And it's not just big countries who will benefit if there is no order. I would argue that any country which will take risks, which will have extreme positions, which would, test the system, will actually use disorder to its advantage. I mean, we've seen in our own neighborhood, you don't have to be a big country to be a risky country. I have some smaller neighbors who have done a pretty good job at that. So, first of all, I think we should all, understand the importance of an order. Now, the old order, it was an order. It was a product of its times. But why I felt that its virtues were exaggerated was, I think the rule maker and the rule taker had somewhat different perspectives, because I also said in the same interview, if you were at the receiving end of some of those rules or the application of those rules, we had issues. And let me give you 2 or 3 practical examples. If you capriciously, if it suits your interest, somebody is good, not good, well, I'll make up my mind how they're going to do. And you apply that order to the same country on the same issues differently. Take Afghanistan. Okay, so the same Afghanistan, the same Taliban, which was an outlier, was welcomed in the Doha process, was welcomed in Oslo. Apparently, at that time, people were okay with it. Today, again, we are going back saying, Taliban is doing all these not so good things. Now, if they were doing all of that, what was discussed in Oslo and Doha? You had a British general who described them at that time as, well, they are country boys with their own honor code. Now, so when it suits you to deal with the Taliban, they're okay. When it is not, they're not okay. You are an extremist today, you wear a suit and tie, you are okay. I think I have a problem with that. Let's give you a second example. We all speak of sovereignty and territorial integrity. All of us agree. It's a vital principle. It's a bedrock of global rules. After the Second World War, the longest standing illegal, I would say, presence, occupation of a territory by another country pertains to India. What we saw in Kashmir. Now, we went to the UN. What was an invasion was made into a dispute. So the attacker and the victim were put on par. Who were the culpable parties? UK, Canada, Belgium, Australia, USA. So, pardon me, I have some question marks on that whole order. Now, I can give you many more. We speak today of political interference. When the West goes out into other countries, it's apparently in pursuance of democratic freedoms. When other countries come into the West, it seems to have a very malign intention. So I think we need, if to have an order, there must be fairness. I agree with you, Dominic. We need a strong UN, but a strong UN requires a fair UN. A strong, a global order must have some, some basic consistency of standards. We have military coups to our east in Myanmar. They are no. We have them even more regularly to the west. You know where? They seem to be okay. So I think it's important to audit the working of the world for the last 8 decades and be honest about it, and to understand today that the balances, the shareholdings in the world have changed. We need a different conversation. We need, frankly, in that sense, a different order.
I move now to Dubai Abul Hol. The order-disorder dialectic is perhaps historically most keenly felt or pronounced in your part of the world, the Middle East. You represent an Arab voice, a West Asian voice on the panel. 100 years ago, Western powers began building peace, between double quotes, in the Middle East. They failed spectacularly. They're still failing. Now we have the paradox of an Arab country hosting and brokering peace between two warring European nations. How can we, and I purposefully use we here, do it better?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you all here today. And I have to say, hearing the sentence 100 years ago, Western powers sought to bring peace to the Middle East sounds eerily similar to what we're hearing today in the news. But the difference is, I would say, 100 years ago, what Western powers actually did in the region was not bring peace. It was enforcing colonial imposition, arbitrary borders, and governance models that were frankly parachuted into the region. They were not built by the region. And so what we see today is the result of it being not peace, but fragility. And it's a legacy of externally dictated arrangements that often ignored the political, social, and perhaps more importantly, economic realities of the region. But the paradox you mentioned is indeed striking. An Arab country and a Gulf country today is, in fact, attempting to broker peace between warring European nation But this reversal, I believe, underscores a very fundamental shift that's happening in our part of the world that's not getting enough attention. And it is that Arab Gulf countries in particular will no longer just be passive subjects of a new international order. They're actually quite active shapers of it. And this changes the dynamic in a way that I think requires us to approach the question of how can we, and I think we here, I can broadly say Arab states, but also Global South, South-South cooperation more broadly, how we can do it better is as follows. One, sustainable peace cannot be imposed. It has to be facilitated. And I think that's the key thing that would be a difference from traditionally Western imposed peace building processes, is there's no legacy of sort of neo-colonial objectives. There's no sense of trying to have a one-size-fits-all model on how peace should and should not look like. And there's a certain legitimacy and credibility to that because we've actually lived how wrong that went. And secondly, I think we must prioritize economic interdependence as part of peace-building processes, and the Gulf is perfectly situated to put forth such an arrangement. The formula I think that is yet to be cracked is how can we make war too costly, and how can we make cooperation too beneficial to move away from. And thirdly, we must embrace multi-alignment as a strategy rather than a liability. And I think India does this brilliantly. And what makes the Global South, I think, the future of peace building and peace processes today is that it's going to approach with a bigger capacity for genuine, non-ideological non-alignment. And that is something that has been particularly absent when we've conflated the term Western with global when it comes to values, but also political processes more broadly.
Thank you. Carl Bilch, let me ask you a provocative question. The last one was provocative enough. Since the end of the Cold War, there has been a widespread belief in Europe and elsewhere that the era of map making and political cartography is behind us. It's over. After January 20th, is a new era of map making and territorial change upon us. When the world order changes, do our maps change?
Well, if you talk about a new era of map making, I hope you're wrong, because a new era of map making would be a new era of war. That's we Europeans tend to be, and we're not alone, we tend to be fairly fundamentalist on respecting borders. And that's based on the bitter historical experience that all of these, you can call them, as the US president did the other day on the US-Canadian border, artificial lines drawn on a map. They are artificial lines, all of them, but they've all been drawn by blood, rivers of blood through history. And if you start to mess with borders, the only thing that is certain is that blood will start to flow again. You can do peaceful changes. Czechoslovakia was divided into the Slovak Republic and the Czech Republic in perfect, peaceful, harmonious divorce. Those things happen. But the historical lesson is otherwise fairly clear. And that is why, going back to Ukraine again, but going back to Saddam Hussein in Kuwait, going back to annexations in the Middle East, these are dangerous things, both in themselves and because they could send that message as to imply that there's a new era of map making. And if it's a new era of map making, then some are strong and some are weak. And the strong will draw the borders in the way they want. 1962 might be remembered in this part of the world as another exercise in map making that was dangerous. And you can see the strong reaction that we have on these issues. And as I said, artificial lines. You could always go back in history and say things were like that before. 1,000 years ago, we had that particular land. Accordingly, we have the right to land now. The US president, to take him again, because he happens to be fairly active in this particular debate, I've noticed, he said that the one way or the other, they will get Greenland. Well, Greenland has been part of Denmark longer than California has been part of the United States. Well, even Texas, I think. I don't want to give any idea to the Mexicans here, but I mean, You see, when you start to play with borders, you play with blood. And that is why we are. Then it has to be said, there are some difficult cases sometimes. We did manage, it was managed overall, a peaceful breakup of the Soviet Union. Overall, there were exceptions. The breakup of Yugoslavia was not managed in a peaceful way, as we know. And there was a borderline case which is still complicated from the point of international law, and that was Kosovo. Because much the same way as with Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, the independent republics had the right to independence. Kosovo wasn't a republic, but it was nearly a republic. It had been deprived of some of the rights of republic status. So it didn't have the automatic right to independence that Bosnia or Slovenia or Serbia or Croatia had. Macedonia, North Macedonia these days. And that created an ambiguous situation that has been somewhat painful from the point of international law and resulted in another war, as we know. So that's why we are, and that's why we are, due to rather bitter historical experience, rather fundamentalist on respecting borders.
Fair enough, sobering words. Dominic Hassler, a provocative question for you as well. You represent a small but extremely prosperous and successful country, a financial center with very high per capita GDP. Don't countries such as yours inevitably compromise sovereignty to become so successful? Why and when is that a problem?
So thank you very much for this provocative question, and I would allow myself to give a provocative answer. I would say it's the complete opposite. We in Liechtenstein always regarded cooperation and integration as a safeguard and a means of shaping our sovereignty. And it was never isolationism, and it was never building up walls. And if we look back to our history, I said it before, 300 years, same borders, surrounded by war, but we have never been affected. Of course, first point, it helped us that we had good neighbors, for which we are very thankful. But in 1970, even though we have good neighbors, our Prince, His Serene Highness, Prince Adam II, he held a very, very symbolic and a very visionary speech to the population. He said back then, and he chose the symbol of backpack. Even though we are, as Liechtenstein, surrounded by good neighbors, we shouldn't depend on the backpackers of others. We should stand up for our own sovereignty. And that was the first step also to go into the process to be part of international bodies. First, we joined the Council of Europe. It wasn't easy at all because we really had to prove that back then, though 30,000 inhabitants are able to be a state and to act like a state. And afterwards, in 1990, when we had experience with international bodies, we could join the UN. So it was always cooperation and integration. And if you are asking me about the economical success also there, Liechtenstein is part of the EA. We are not a member of the EU, but we are part of the internal market. We implemented 10,000 of EU acts. One could say if you implement foreign acts that could perhaps influence your sovereignty. But in my country, it was always, we are highly industrialized, not only a financial sector. It was always the case that this legal frameworks gives us also sovereignty. And I think it's the same with international law. We gave us this framework also at the UN. And sometimes in those times, I have the feeling that you could believe that UN only serves smaller countries. Of course, a small country like mine always knows from morning until night and from night until morning, 24 hours, that we are dependent on the international law. But my colleague from India, he spoke of my heart when he says the UN serves for everybody, whether you are small or big. And I think that is multilateralism. That is sitting on a panel, a country with 40,000 inhabitants versus a country with 1.46 billion inhabitants. And we do say the same. We need a strong multilateralism. We need a well-functioning UN. And I think that is a symbol of that it is worth to fight for.
Juraj Blana, your two previous colleagues have spoken with some passion about European institutional architecture and integrity. Quite honestly, for 8 decades, the United States has underwritten European sovereignty. Mr. Trump has new ideas. From here on, how will Europe secure its territorial integrity and its sense of sovereignty?
Thank you for this question. I think you are right. What is right now happening is that U.S. Administration is asking Europe to take care of our own defense and security. And as you mentioned, we celebrate 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So it is about the right time to do something right now. And it's just like a bit happened in India. We Europeans are now trying to become more independent and more autonomous in the field of defense and security. It does not mean losing strategic ties with the US, of course, and Canada. Quite to the contrary. It is about becoming more equal security partners within our NATO's allies across the Atlantic. The war in Ukraine revived NATO's collective defense reliance. Two new members, Sweden and Finland, joined the alliance, and now many countries of the EU 23 are at the same time a member of NATO. So now Mr. Trump is asking us to spend more on the defense and our own security. It is what every US president since the Cold War started has been calling for. For us, in Slovakia, with very low budget, two things are important in this respect. So this investment should respect also benefit defense to the public, which can be done through the dual use of projects like bridges, railways, and infrastructure overall, and hospital. And since the Slovakia is in a Eurozone member, is also very important to adjust the fiscal rule for compliance with the European Central Bank and so on. So Slovakia is meeting our defense spending commitments. We have spent the required 2% of GDP on defense, out of which 20% is spent for modernization. So we spend more than 35%. And in the condition about the Met, we are ready to commit to even more. But of course, there is a debate. Europe is going to be alone without the US? No, we have to cooperate within the NATO and try to introduce a new strategy how the Europeans will be managing own defense and security system. That's very clear, and I think Slovakia is ready to contribute into this debate.
Thank you. S. Jaishankar, we've heard three different but equally honest expositions of the European idea. When it comes to India, it's often said that, or sometimes said that, India can see all three sides of a bipolar debate. Now, this is a tribute to our dexterity, yes, but is it also a failing? We seem to straddle many boats. G7, as well as the Global South, Quad, as well as BRICS. We don't take a clear position one way or the other on the Ukraine-Russia war. In all this, what is the authentic Indian position? If I could put it so as a fellow citizen, who are we?
who are we? I would say maybe there are 3-4 dimensions which are important to understand India. First of all, the global south, the decolonization, because it is impossible to appreciate India's global positions without being cognizant of the colonial history. Because when you have lost your independence and struggle to recover it, there is a whole mindset which comes with it. So I would say very definitely global south is one. Two, democratic. Our choice in the 1940s to become a modern democratic polity, I argue we draw on our own traditions in that regard. To be a democratic polity, to be a market economy, to be a society which respects faiths, I think this is also a very important part of our DNA. And sometimes even we in India take it a bit for granted, but many of our positions take this into account. Third, I would argue that in a way we have navigated, adapted to a world which has not always been kind to us, which has not always been accommodating at us, but we have in that sense developed a certain skill of which you make some reference, but a way of really, I would call it both a tactical skill but a long view, that we have a not, a 5-year, 10-year necessarily horizon and understanding of ourselves. And for today, as the most populous country in the world, as the 5th largest economy of the world, perhaps third by the end of this decade, in various other domains, you can see, we are doing more, we are contributing more. I think the idea of a multipolar world, and where India itself is concerned, to think of how to become a leading power at some point of time. I think these are the the global south character, the democratic character, the adapting long view aspect, and a multipolar world towards which we are working. I think if you keep these in mind, a lot of what we do in different situations would make sense. Now, you put your question in a certain way. I understand why you want to elicit a certain reply from me. But I want you to think back, because you began by saying 23, 24, 25, how has it changed? I would argue many of the positions we took in 23 and 24 on this very platform, which at that time were not necessarily liked, today stood the test of time.
True. Dubai Abul Hol, I'd like to take that same point about taking the long view to your part of the world. Sitting at conferences like this one, discussing sovereignty, territorial integrity, agency of domestic decision making, all of this sounds almost theoretical if you consider Syria or Lebanon. The best antidote, and I guess India is one example of this, is state formation, robust state formation. Shouldn't the Arab world also look inwards?
I think, frankly, from a distance, it might look like territorial integrity and sovereignty seem like theoretical debates when it comes to states like Syria and Lebanon. But we cannot brush over the fact that state institutions in many parts of the Middle East have been hollowed out. And they've been hollowed out by war, by conflict, by foreign interference. And yes, I think a core solution will have to be empowering stronger state authority. But I would argue what's more important than that is having the Arab world look inwards to decide what does Arab agency and legitimacy look like going forward. So looking inward, yes, is important, but that shouldn't be an exercise of further isolating the region away from its wider neighborhood. And I think on the debate of what does agency look like for the Arab world and Arab states today, two things are very important, and two things have to be more honestly open to debate. And one of them is regional institutionalization. What does Arab multilateralism look like today? We need to have an inward exercise of saying, okay, if we're talking about how the international community has failed us, how multilateralism is broken, how can we build our own multilateral arrangements that can work for the region and by the region? And that does not just include perhaps expanding the mandate of the Arab League or the GCC. These are kind of easy wins, I would say, or a more of a clear pathway forward. But we also have to look at thematic multilateralism in the region in sectors like water, but also AI and food security. And so there needs to be instead of waiting for the world to rearrange itself to sort of suit our needs, we have to build our own multilateral frameworks that work for our region. And secondly, is technology and defense capabilities. There has to be a decades-long investment in domestic capacity building when it comes to these two sectors, because it's not sustainable for the region. I think much of the world to be in panic every 4 years whenever there's a new White House, and how that directly impacts domestic security and defense capabilities. So I think, yes, we've spoken a lot about how the world has failed us, but we need to take matters, I think, as a region in our own hands in a way that fits what we need in 2025 and beyond.
That's a good way to move to audience questions. We have less than 5 minutes, so we'll have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then the panel will close with quick closing remarks. I'll move first to the young fellows. If anyone has a question there, identify yourself with your name and institutional affiliation and ask a simple, focused question, please. Go ahead.
Hello, good morning. This is Meena from Malaysia. Minister Jaishankar, you mentioned India's role in the global south. Do you think India has any appetite to be a normative power in the region? Thank you.
Normative power. We'll take a couple of more questions. If there are mics on both sides, if you can walk to the mic. Anyone else from the young fellows who has a question? Look, you need to walk to the mic. Just don't have your hands up. Just go to the mic. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. My name is Australia. My question relates to artificial intelligence and the apparent acceleration track that it's on. So my question to you is, do you see, on balance, AI being a net negative or a net positive for defending national sovereignty? If you see opportunities, how do we capitalize on them? If you see risks, how do we manage them? Thank you.
That's to the entire panel or any one person?
Whoever may wish to answer.
Whoever may start. And one more question, someone there. Yes, go ahead, the lady.
Good morning, everybody. So my question is to Honorable Jaishankar. I'd like to draw your attention to the Quad, where the leadership changes have been very acute. We've seen Australia transition between Scott to Anthony, Japan from Shinzo Abe to Shida, and US from Biden to Trump. And of course, in India, the Prime Minister Modi has, provided a sense of continuity amidst the global shift.
Your question, please.
Yeah. So, as India assumes the presidency of the Quad this year, how do you envision India leading the way and setting the tone for the critical grouping? And now coming back to a related note.
Just one question. Fine. Thank you. Anyone else from that side for the final question?
The second from the
Go ahead.
AI. Artificial.
No one? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Josiane Kotayer from Town. I have to. So, hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the.
Ma'am, just a question, please, quick.
Discussion. Cyber. But also the role that you see when it comes to cyber and how we should also discuss this on a multilateral aspect, because it's a known geopolitical weapon that is being already used. And it's critical that we look into this aspect too.
Thank you. So we have 2 questions for Mr. Jaishankar, in particular, normative power and Quad, and general questions on AI, cybersecurity, which I'd request the rest of the panel to also take in their closing remarks. No, sir. We're done, sir. We're done, sir. Please. We're out of time. So I'll go quickly starting with you, Mr. Jaishankar.
Okay. the characteristics when I spoke about India, global south, democratic, market economy, the long view, I think in a way that I don't want to call it a normative power, but I think we are very representative in many ways. And as the biggest country in the world, I guess our successes or shortcomings will have an impact on everybody else, especially in the global south. On AI, I would, of course, consider it obviously a clear net plus. On Quad, look, the first meeting, diplomatic engagement of the incoming Trump administration on January 21 was Quad. So I think that tells you what they think of Quad and what all of us think of Quad. And on cyber, I would say the more digital we get, obviously, the more important cyber gets. And like anything in life today, obviously, it can be weaponized. And because it can be weaponized, it needs to be safeguarded.
Thank you. Dubai, anyone issue you want to pick up and comment on as closing comments?
I wanted to just highlight the idea of alternative multilateralism. We've spoken at length about UN reform, but that conversation cannot just be within the halls of the UNGA every September. There needs to be a greater investment in alternative new mechanisms, including BRICS and others, because we cannot just wait for the UN to reform itself.
Great. Juraj, do you want to respond to any of the questions?
So about the AI, I think it's our responsibility as elected leaders to make sure that our society are resilient to external manipulation and interference. So that means, first of all, we need to make sure that our norms, laws, and procedures are up to date to the most recent technological advance and hybrid tactics. So we have to be ready for this and to prepare ourselves.
Thank you. Dominic, nothing. Carl, you have the last word.
Yes, just briefly on AI, I agree, net positive. But in this world of turmoil that we're living at the moment, we should recognize that there are three areas where we, irrespective of everything else, need to work together. One is global health, second is climate change, and the third is AI. We need guardrails. We need some principles that unites everyone. And we now have a process inside the UN. We have a G20 Hiroshima process. We have a series of AI security summits. We have a bilateral US-China dialogue, at least we had one. I don't know if it's still ongoing. And we need to bring all of this together at some point in time into some sort of guardrail framework that applies to all of us in order to be able to use all of the net positive that's going to be there.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for the audience. I now hand you back to the organizers who will take us into the rest of the program.